the Senate's version of the COVID relief bill, which is, in fact, not a coronavirus bill at all. I mean, here let me explain why. There's a $350 billion state and local government bailout in here. There's a $130 billion bailout to schools, but only 5% is going to be available this year when schools actually reopen. We talked about no Hyde Amendment protections. We talked about the $50 million to Planned Parenthood. There's $30 billion for transit grants, $1.5 billion for Amtrak, $135 million for the National Endowment for the Arts, $135 million for the National Endowment for the Humanities, $200 million for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, $12 billion for foreign assistance. I don't even know what that means exactly. We have to dig into that. $12 billion. $50 million for EPA environmental justice grants when, my gosh, we haven't even, there's barely been any air travel or car travel for so long. I mean, this is when we're going to need $50 million in justice grants. You know how quickly the government goes through $50 million?
You're going to get different people that think that spending for the National Endowment for the Humanities is COVID spending. So you're going to see estimates anywhere from 10 to maybe 35% of this bill is COVID related. But in my view, Jordan, that's pretty much the end of it. And I would just note this. I mean, $1.9 trillion in a COVID stimulus bill, and how much of it is spent on testing and vaccination? $20 billion.
At worst is 10% related to that. At best, it's 35% related to that, and that's like if you include an endowment to the National Endowment for the Arts as part of COVID relief, which, again, I wouldn't. So I'm more of the 10% side. And this will actually cost taxpayers about $5,600 each because this is a $1.9 trillion bill. $1.9 trillion. There's no Hyde Amendment protections in this whatsoever, which means that the dollars that come out of this, your taxpayer dollars that flow back to community health centers and Obamacare accounts and COBRA plans, etc., they'll be able to use that money directly for abortions unless the House were to change that, which is hard to imagine because the House is controlled by Democrats. And, of course, it's not something that Joe Biden's concerned about because he's controlled by Planned Parenthood.
It's really the first time in more than 40 years that a relevant spending bill has not had this protection. Now, our listeners know this. Maybe some Americans don't. The Hyde Amendment is generally most applicable to the Labor Age Appropriations Bill because that's where most of the spending dollars that could be used on abortion get spent. But, Jordan, when you have these extra spending bills like this stimulus bill is, typically that protection goes ahead and attaches to the bill because some of the accounts in there could go to health community centers, things of that nature. Jordan, and the most relevant example here is the 5 stimulus bills that were passed last year in a bipartisan fashion. All of those had the Hyde Amendment language and protections attached to it. This did not. Jordan, in my view, there's a lot of really bad stuff in here, but in my view, this is the worst policy change in this bill. And honestly, it's a finger in the eye of the pro-life community.
We're talking about unleashing this money for Planned Parenthood to receive, for people to use for abortions, which would oftentimes that would go to Planned Parenthood facilities, and then a $50 million direct payment under Title X to Planned Parenthood. Now, this is what's in the Senate bill that's bad. There's a lot more that's bad we'll go through as we continue on the broadcast. But again, just when it comes to that life provision, when it comes to being pro-life, or just the idea that regardless of where you are on the issue, our taxpayer dollars shouldn't fund the ending of an unborn child's life. And that because so many Americans feel strongly about it, it's not something we should force them to have to pay for. At the most liberal, most pro-supportive of this bill, only 35% of it, a third of it, is actually going towards COVID relief. And as Stan said, with all those different COVID portions, only $20 billion going to really just making this over, getting this done with in America for the most part, so we can get back to life.